So thanks for having me here. And this will be, I hope, a welcome respite for the way politics is going nowadays and the way the news is gripping us all. Because when Jan asked me to talk to the Lincoln County Dems, I said, well, I can't do a partisan talk at all, especially with an election coming up. But this is a time when it's fun to look back at our history. So what I wanted to do is take a look today at the concept of political parties, and why we have political parties in this country, and how we got political parties, and perhaps some of the problems with political parties. So this is going to be a tour through early American history. I don't often get to do it. I hope you find it entertaining, and I hope it takes us in places that you find interesting. So let me start here by sharing my screen so you can follow along with the slides I put together to illustrate what I was going to talk about, or what I want to talk about. So you should now have in front of you a series of images, starting with something that says the role of political parties in American democracy. Is that the case? I could use a nod if you have it.
Yes.
You have it? Good. All right, so let's talk about political parties. Like, there's a couple of theories about political parties. Some people think they're bad because what they do is they tear down people's opponents, and they mischaracterize each other's policies, so that, the Republicans talk about Democrats in a really nasty way, and vice versa, the Democrats talk about Republicans in a really nasty way. And they mischaracterize what each other represents. So a lot of people get really turned off by parties and say, we don't need them, they're a terrible thing. What I want to do tonight is to argue that we need them terribly, because they are central to our system. And the reasons that I'm going to argue they're central to our system is, first of all, because they allow the mechanics of democracy to work. So, for example, our Constitution has the Article 1, which sets forward the Congress, and Article 2, which sets forth the executive, and Article 3, which sets forth the judiciary, but it never links Congress and the executive. How are they supposed to talk to each other? Well, there's no way for them to talk to each other unless we have some sort of an organization like a political party to link those two things together. Political parties also allow for the peaceful transition of power, because they give us the idea in America that opposition to the government is legitimate. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. And what that means is that it's okay for power to rotate in our country, for one party to be in power and then another party to be in power. That that's simply the way our system works, and that's okay. And they also allow there to be, as I say, a legitimate opposition. Now, a lot of people don't realize that, in fact, we had a period in America when opposition was considered illegitimate. And that was in the southern states during the Confederacy. The Confederate states did not allow an opposition. It was a one-party state. And of course, that didn't go well for the Confederacy, because there was no way for people to channel their opposition to Jefferson Davis. And what they did was they tore the Confederacy apart. In fact, some historians think that's why the Confederacy failed. I don't happen to be one of them. But there is an argument to be made that the Confederacy does not succeed because of the lack of political parties. Political parties also allow us to criticize people in power. Authoritarian governments have these rituals sometimes where they seem to be engaging in self-criticism, but generally, if you think about it, that's sort of public confession and a purge of people who aren't friendly enough to the authoritarian figure. They're really not so much about legitimately critiquing the way that society or that political party works. So they let people criticize a government. They also allow people to have a say in how their government is going to work. And what that means to me is that in a political party, for a political party to be legitimate, it has to have a realistic chance of governance. It has to realistically be able to take on the governance of the entire country. So one of the things that you have to protect in a democracy is the ability for each party that is recognized as a real player to be able both to be elected but then to be able to go ahead and to govern once it is elected. So for example, in 1844, the Liberty Party was really kind of a one-trick pony. It really didn't look very much like it could, in fact, govern the whole nation, because it really only had one topic that it cared a lot about. So in order to have this two-party system, you have to believe, or multi-party system, you have to believe that your party can govern effectively, that it has real leaders and real policies, that it actually can win, and then crucially, that it actually can govern. And we have in the past had parties who come to power and who once they manage to win power, but then they can't govern. They don't really have any of the people that they need to govern effectively. And you can see this really dramatically in Galveston, Texas at the turn of the last century, about from 18 to 1900s, when a terrible hurricane hits Galveston, and the government in charge of Galveston simply can't handle it. They not only cannot do the search and rescue and emergency operations themselves. When people actually rush aid to Galveston to try and help it rebuild, they can't handle the money either. And what we get out of that is an entirely new governmental system, not only in Galveston, but also for other metropolitan areas. So what I'm going to argue today is that America's political system depends on at least two functioning parties. And the fact that there have been attacks recently on the idea of there being two parties is a real problem for our democracy. So what I want to do today is get people excited about the idea of having a healthy two-party system. But I want to leave you with perhaps a caveat to that. And that is the idea that because we got the rise of partisanship in America after the construction of the Constitution, it has left us with some legacies that have injured our democracy and that we're going to have to grapple with going forward. All right, so let's start with the idea of legitimate opposition, which we're used to, right? We don't think a lot about it, but think about Europe before the construction of an American nation. And you had the idea of the king, of course, occasionally the queen, but the king and his advisors around him. And, you know, when I was first beginning to study this stuff, I kind of thought about like the king and maybe like 12 people around him. Not at all. This is a picture here of St. James, and this is a sense of just how many people there were around the king's ministers, the king's officers, who were determining how the country should be run, how society should work. And they are the government. The people who are loyal to the king are the government, and they make up, this is in France, of course, they make up the body of the government. And if you are not loyal to them, you are disloyal, and you are a traitor, and you're going to lose your head and your life. I mean, they kind of go together. But the point I'm trying to make is that the concept of being loyal to the state, but not necessarily loyal to the people in power, is a pretty recent one. You know, previously you were either loyal to the king or you were disloyal and you lost your head. And I actually just randomly picked Thomas Percy here, the Earl of Northumberland, who plotted against Queen Elizabeth. And his payment for that was, of course, the loss of his head. And that was expected because you were either loyal to the king, you were loyal to the government, or you were disloyal and you needed to be purged from society. So the idea that you can be a loyal opposition is a pretty new one. The idea behind having a loyal opposition really comes out of the early 1700s, the late 1600s and early 1700s in England. And it's associated most with this guy here, Viscount Bolingbroke. And what he does is he takes on this old concept of l'état c'est moi, I'm the state, so you either like me or you don't, which is of course coming from the king. He takes on that idea and he says, no, it's possible for us to be loyal to our government, loyal to our state, but not necessarily loyal to the people in power. And he begins to speak for a group of people in England, who become known really loosely as the Country Party. Now, they're not organized. They're not a a political party. But what they are is they're people who stand against the idea of that court party I talked about, the people around the king. And they say, listen, we're in favor of the government. We're even in favor of the king. But what we're not in favor of are the ministers who are around the king, because we think they're corrupt. We think they're arranging the government in such a way that it gives them more access to more money than anybody else. It gives them power over little guys like us. And of course, we're not talking about literally like the farmers in the British countryside. We're talking about, the Mr. Darcy's, the guys who have money and education, but they're not part of that London or metropolitan governmental system. And what they're doing is they're looking at people there and they're saying, wait, the king's ministers and the people with whom they're working in parliament, and they're very concerned about the rise of prime ministers, for example, in the early 1700s. And they look at them and they say, they're arranging the laws of the country in such a way that they privilege the people who are loyal to the king and who are in the king's party and who are corrupt. They're lining their own pockets, and they're making laws that make their industries more valuable than what we are doing out here in the countryside. Plus, they're getting fat and lazy, and they're not virtuous. They're all into the sort of urban things that we think are bad. They're irreligious. They drink too much. They hang out with the wrong kind of women. They are not the sort of people that should be running a government. And the more that they do to try and consolidate power, they're running, for example, laws in such a way that they're monopolizing the trade of the country, and they start to put money into the military, and they have a standing army. The more they do that, the more the Country Party, again, a loose group of people, begins to theorize that it's possible to be loyal to the king, but not to be loyal to his ministers. Now, why have I belabored this to the degree I have? Because this language sounds really familiar to Americans. Colonists at this point, they're actually not Americans. They're British colonists, and of course, they're way far away from the court party. They're over there on that newfangled North American continent, and they start to look at what's happening with the court party around the king, and they start to say, no, we're totally loyal to the king, but we're not so keen on what the king's ministers are doing to us and are doing to the laws under which we live. So, for example, after the French and Indian War, in the 1700s, when the king's ministers start to put taxes on the American colonies, believing that they're simply not paying their freight in terms of taxation, the colonists look at that and they say, wait a minute, this sounds an awful lot like what the Country Party warned us about, that the people around the king are using their power to put taxes on people like us and to hem in our liberties. John Adams, for example, who is going to be a leader of the American colonists in their eventual attempt to throw off the British rule, claimed that he read Bolingbroke's writings 5 times, that he was that into the idea of Bolingbroke. And as the Americans are looking at the increasing taxes that the British government is putting on them in the wake of the French and Indian War in the 1750s, they begin to push back against the idea of this court party, but they're still loyal to the king. So they start to get this idea that it's possible to be loyal to the king, to the state, at the same time that you are not necessarily loyal to the apparatus of the state. And what I'm trying to throw out here is the idea of the gradual rise of the idea that it's possible to be loyal to the state, but not loyal to the current government, which, as I say, is a real change in the way people think about politics. So by 1765, when the Americans are, I'm sorry, when Parliament puts onto Americans the Quartering Act, for example, the idea that Americans are going to have to raise taxes to pay for a standing army in their midst, and that the Quartering Act didn't literally mean that that soldiers were going to live in your house. It meant that you were going to have to pay for soldiers to live in boarding houses, and since so many boarding houses actually were in people's houses, that's where we got that confusion. But Americans are supposed to be paying taxes for a standing army, and they lose with the Stamp Act here their right to a trial by jury. Both things that seem to them to indicate that the Parliament and the people who are around the king are going ahead and putting pressure against the liberties of good, loyal citizens. So you can see throughout the early colonial period, I'm sorry, the 1750s and the 1760s, an increasing pushback in the American political discourse, the cartoons, for example, of this idea that somehow there is this group around the king that is does not have the interests of the colonies at heart. Now, I'm not actually talking about the reality of what happened or why it made sense for the king and the Parliament to go ahead and put those taxes on Americans, but rather the way that Americans looked at it. You have, of course, in 1773, you have the altercation between American colonials and the British soldiers. And in that case, the American colonials were actually throwing bricks and rocks at the soldiers who panicked and opened fire. But it gets portrayed in the American literature and the American newspapers as this really vicious moment when soldiers dressed here in crisp uniforms open fire on these seemingly innocent colonials who in reality weren't innocent at all. But it gets portrayed as a say of there being this part of the government that is deliberately trying to destroy the rights of the colonists. This plays out, of course, in front of the Boston State House. And I have this picture here because the State House here looked so weeny there with all the buildings around it. But there is, just let me put a bee in your ear here, there is a project right now in which gamers are putting together a picture of what Boston looked like the morning of the Boston Massacre. So within about 2 years, you're going to be able to go on YouTube and actually walk the streets of what Boston looked like. And I've seen a prototype of it. And what's interesting about it is the Boston State House that now looks so weeny, it just dominates the whole landscape. It's huge for the time. And so it really stands out, and you can see why it makes such an impression, what happens there with the Boston Massacre. Nonetheless, the Americans continue to blame the ministers and not the king for what happened going forward in things like the Boston Tea Party in 1773 in December, when they make an effort to make known their displeasure with the idea that there's going to be these taxes on tea. And finally, in 1775, the American colonials are still maintaining that they are loyal to the king, but they are not loyal to the ministers at that point. And in 1775, they send a petition to the king. It's called the Olive Branch Petition, in which they say, just take us back to where we were at the end of the French and Indian Wars, and we'll be good with you. We'll go ahead and go back to the way that the empire used to look. And the king won't even hear that. He won't even accept the Olive Branch Petition, which is why we have in our Constitution that we have the right to petition our government. They don't have to do what we say, but we have the right to ask. But with that rejection of the Olive Branch Petition in 1775, what happens is something really dramatic. And that's in 1776. Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense. And that pamphlet, Common Sense, is really earth-shattering, because with Common Sense in 1776, Thomas Paine actually says, you know what? It's not just the king's ministers, it's the king. And we don't need a king anyway. We can go ahead and we can run our affairs our own way. And that's why Thomas Paine's Common Sense is such a big deal, as he says, you know what? It's not just that we are a loyal opposition and we don't like the ministers. We actually don't like the king either. So that raises the question then, what happens when Americans decide to make their own government? They go ahead and they create first the First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, and eventually the Articles of Confederation. But if that's the case, what do you do about partisanship? Because you don't need partisanship any longer, because you got rid of the king's party. You got rid of the party that's around him. And now we're all good, right? We're the people who objected to those ministers who didn't have our interests at heart, who were corrupt, who were lining their own pockets, who weren't very virtuous. And instead, we have created a government that is made up only of those of us who are virtuous and who have only the country's interests at heart. And we're going to be able to make this government that does not require political parties, or so they think. So what happens is that the founders hated political parties. They thought they didn't need political parties. They thought that the whole point of the American Revolution was to go ahead and create a government in which people ruled themselves. And if people ruled themselves, you didn't need to have political parties, because it's only with the rise of a demagogue or some kind of too powerful leader that you need to have political parties at all. So why would you need that sort of thing? They in fact think they don't need it at all. And they especially don't need it in the early years of the founding, because if you think about the body politic in the early years of the American Republic, pretty much everybody was a white man with some property. So their interests don't vary all that much. So it's easy for them to say, oh, I have the interests of the entire country at heart. I don't have to worry about factionalism. I don't have to worry about these people or these people, because we pretty much all agree. And famously in these early years, somebody praised Virginia planter Edmund Pendleton by saying, none of his opinions were drawn from personal views or party prejudices. He never had a connection with any political party. His opinions were the result of his own judgment, and that judgment was rendered upon the best unbiased estimate he could make of the public good. So they go ahead and they write a constitution without believing in political parties. Our entire constitution was written with the idea that America would not have political parties. And that's going to lead to two really weird weaknesses in our Constitution. I'm going to talk about the Electoral College. I'm not going to talk about impeachment, but I will talk about impeachment in questions if you would like. But this raises the question when people looked at the Constitution and they said, wait a minute, how can you possibly have a government that covers this big an area without worrying about political parties? And that's where we get the very famous article from James Madison called Federalist Number 10. And what Federalist Number 10 does is James Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution, goes ahead and says, you know, we don't really have to worry about parties in our large republic, because what will happen here is that there will be different parties, but they'll do a couple of things. First of all, they'll cancel each other out. We're not going to have the rise of demagogues because we're too big for that. And second of all, our republic is big enough that we'll get really good people in office, and we'll make sure to elect only the very virtuous. Just had to lay that out there. So how does this play out? This plays out with the idea that because America is so big, it's going to have checks and balances. The different political parties, factions he calls them, but he doesn't mean organized parties. He means different interests are going to cancel each other out. And interestingly enough, that idea comes in America from the idea of religion. So after America's early established religions, Americans turned to toleration for all kinds of religious backgrounds. And Madison reaches back really heavily into that history of religious pluralism to ground our political pluralism in his understanding of religious pluralism. So he reaches back to a famous minister at the time, a guy named Ezra Stiles, who talks about how, as he says, coercive uniformity is neither necessary in politics nor religion, Providence has placed the British America with a variety of sects, he means religious sects, which will unavoidably become a mutual balance upon one another. Their temporary collisions, like the action of acids and alkalis, after a short mixture will subside in harmony and union, not by the destruction of either, but by the cohabitation of all. And Madison writes in another Federalist paper, Federalist Number 51, he says, in a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. It consists in the one case in the multiplicity of interests, and in the other in the multiplicity of sects. So it's really important to the early founders that there is not going to be an establishment of religion, and that there is not going to be an establishment of a certain party in the country. The poet Alexander Pope put it best, one of my favorite lines in early American history: not chaos-like, together crushed and bruised, but as the world harmoniously confused, where order in variety we see, and where, though all things differ, all agree. E pluribus unum. So when they go to put an executive in charge of the country, Americans turn pretty obviously, I mean, they know it's going to happen, to George Washington. And there is not in that first election or in the second one any real partisanship, because everybody has agreed they want this man that they believe to be virtuous, a citizen soldier, somebody who believes that all Americans can work together. They want him in charge of the country and in charge of the Constitution, over which he had presided, the writing over which he had presided, and which was really written with him in mind. And the fact that Americans had come together, that these white men had come together to write that Constitution, is no small thing. I mean, if you're worried about factionalism, the fact that you had people from South Carolina and Massachusetts together managing to agree on a Constitution was itself a model for the idea that you did not need parties. So really memorably, Benjamin Franklin, who's old at this point and signs it, said, "I confess there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not approve, but I'm not sure that I shall never approve them. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions even on important subjects, which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise." And then after the writing of the Constitution, of course, Americans had the model of the ratification of the Constitution, in which both supporters of the Constitution and opponents of the Constitution were reasonable, they were civilized, they did not kill each other. They argued in newspapers, they argued in rap songs nowadays, right? But they didn't go out and they didn't slaughter each other, which was, of course, the model for changing governments in Europe before the arrival of this idea of the idea you could have a reasonable social compact under which people lived. So what happens? It'd be lovely if I could end right there, wouldn't it? What happens is, of course, I'm sorry, we jumped back to Madison. What happens is that George Washington has a problem. He's got a lot of problems, but his big problem is he's in charge of this virtuous republic. Everybody's behind him, right? Everybody agrees. Everyone's going to just have this popular government in which everybody agrees. And of course, this doesn't work at all. George Washington has the problem of trying to make a government function, of trying to make a government that is viable, of trying to make a government that people around the world will consider to be legitimate and will consider to be enough of a threat that they're not going to stomp all over it. So one of the things that he does is he does stuff to look like he's a monarch, to look like he's important. He has a coat of arms. He drives a really nice coach with beautiful cream-colored horses. He has liveried staff. He has very fancy dinners. He recognizes that what he is doing is he is setting up the idea that the president of this new republic should be on a par with the monarchs of the old world. Now, at the same time, he recognizes that that undercuts the idea of Republican simplicity and virtue. So he also walks around Washington in his boots periodically, which he hates to do, by the way. But he does go ahead and sort of promote the idea of the strong president. And almost immediately, people are going to look at that and be concerned that he has gotten above his station. And that's going to hurt even more after 1790 to 1791, when Alexander Hamilton's economic system really makes Republican planters Southern planters who are going to become the Jeffersonian Republicans nervous about the consolidation of power in the federal government. So what Hamilton does is he wants the government to take in all the war debt from the colonies and the Continental Congress during the war, bring it all into the federal government, and then reissue money based on a national bank. And Southern planters don't like that idea, but early on, at least, they are still enough behind the idea that they're all supposed to get along, that they don't attribute ill motives to Alexander Hamilton. There isn't yet the breach that there's going to be between Hamilton and Jefferson. And at this point, Madison actually likes the idea of a stronger state. And what they do, of course, is they cut a deal. They cut a deal that gives, on the one hand, to people who support George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, this idea of a strong state that can have a national bank. And in exchange, they get the location of Washington, D.C. That's the story behind the song in Hamilton, The Room Where It Happened. There's actually a dinner that takes place, and people go in, Hamilton and Jefferson go in completely opposed to each other. They come out with a deal where Hamilton gets his new economic system, and Jefferson essentially gets a swamp, but it's a swamp in the middle of the South at the time. And people believe, he believes certainly, that that's going to give more power to the Southerners in the federal government to balance the power that supporters of Washington are going to get by having this federal bank. Increasingly, though, people who support the idea of the bank and who support the ideas of Hamilton and of Washington begin to use the federal government in ways that people who are adhering strictly to the Constitution get really nervous about. So, for example, they begin to use what they call the implied powers of the Constitution, not simply the letter of the Constitution, but the implied powers of the Constitution. And when they do that, of course, the Southern planters begin to turn against Washington and begin to object to this increasingly strong federal government. And from whom do they take their cues? From the Country Party back in England. So Jefferson and Madison begin to object to the idea of what they see as an increasingly strong federal government, and they begin to form their own political party. And it's kind of a joke with my students that I'm always rooting on Thomas Jefferson. And there are many reasons that you can not like Thomas Jefferson, but what infuriates me is he's always going to Washington and going like, oh my, he's so hypocritical. So I was like, people are making political parties. There's all these horrible people making political parties. Well, who's making the political party? He is. Jefferson is really the one who goes ahead and organizes this first concept of being loyal to the United States government, but not necessarily being loyal to the people running it, to people like Alexander Hamilton or even to George Washington. And this is really going to tear itself apart with the outbreak of the French Revolution. So with the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 and 1799, the fight in America between the idea of a strong federal government embraced by Hamilton and Washington on the one hand, and the idea of the government of the people, and mind you, this is still a people that consists of white propertied men on the other, led by people like Hamilton, like Jefferson and Madison, is really going to come to a head. And where it's going to come to a head is that the Jeffersonians want to recognize the French Revolution and want to increase their support for the French and for their belief in independence and in the government, the idea of a government, a republic or a democracy on the one hand, which again is really interesting considering they actually literally enslave other human beings. And on the other hand, people like Hamilton and Washington who look at the French Revolution and say, man, you know, they're like cutting people's heads off, and they're destroying their nation in order to have this government of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. So that idea of a government of the people is really a frightening thing to Americans who are more interested at that point in security and in guaranteeing that the American government stays out of a war that could completely undermine it. So what happens? Increasingly, Washington begins to speak out against the democratic societies in America that are supporting the French Revolution. And increasingly, he turns against the idea of the people taking control of the American government. And finally, he gets so frustrated by this fight between the growing parties in America that he decides he doesn't want to play any longer. This is one of the major reasons that Washington steps down from the presidency. And in his farewell address, he warns Americans not to fall into the trap of parties. He says, for example, "I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical divisions." He's worried about the rise of those southern planters. "Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally." He goes on to say he hopes that his remarks in his farewell address will, quote, "moderate the fury of party spirit, warn against the mischiefs of foreign intrigue, guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism." And he says, if it does so, this will be a full recompense for the solicitude for your welfare by which his remarks have been dictated. So he thinks he can leave Americans behind without a party system. So what happens? Seems like it should make sense, right? He's gone ahead and he stepped down and he said, go ahead and everybody make nice from now on. But what this means is something that has huge repercussions for our democracy today. Because what happens is this means that the election of 1796 is essentially going to be the first election in American history that's contested. Because until then, people were just re-electing Washington, right? In 1796, let me show you another slide here. John Adams, who is of the mindset of Washington, is going to be running against Thomas Jefferson, who is of course opposed to what Adams's Federalist Party is doing, and his sidekick there, Aaron Burr, for those of you who remember that commercial. And what happens is in that election, Jefferson recognizes that he would have won the election if, he doesn't actually win the election, obviously. John Adams wins the election of 1796. But Jefferson would have won if the electoral votes for Virginia had been cast as a block. So let me go back for just a second and explain what that means. What that means is that if you remember in our Constitution, we do not directly elect the president. What we do is we elect electors who go ahead and in turn cast their votes for the president. And the reason that the founders put that system in place was because they weren't at all convinced in an era before modern media, in an era when most people never traveled outside their states, that somebody from Georgia or South Carolina would have any idea who the leading men were in Massachusetts, for example. So what they figured would happen was that people would vote for the leading men in their communities. And those men in turn would come together in the electoral college and they'd argue about who should run the country. And what the founders expected was that they would come up with 2 or 3 names, and those names they would probably not be able to agree on. If they could, that'd be great. But if they didn't agree on it, they would in turn throw that election into the House of Representatives, where every state would have one vote. And that would then determine who the president was. They had all these layers set up. But to make that work, the electors were supposed to be elected by district, rather as if they were members of the House of Representatives. So for example, if you were from a state, and I'm making this up, that had 10 electors, you would elect your elector, and maybe 6 electors would go for one candidate and 4 electors would go for the other. And they would go and they would argue in the electoral Congress about which one of these candidates should be good. Jefferson looks at this. That's not actually written in the document, how those electors are going to be distributed. So he looks at the Constitution and he says, if I get Virginia to go as a block for me, I'm going to win. And so that is exactly what happens. In the election of 1800, we get a new way of counting the Electoral College when the electors for Virginia vote as a block. This is the beginning of what we know as the winner-take-all system. And it so horrifies people like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison that they go ahead and they say, this is insane. What will happen if we start awarding electoral votes based on an entire state rather than by district is we could actually end up with presidents who are not supported by the majority of the American people. That is, partisanship in this case has overruled the idea of a representative government. So Madison goes ahead and he writes a very famous letter in which he says, we must amend the Constitution to make sure that this can never happen again. And then of course that's Madison, who's sort of, arm in arm with Jefferson at this point, but he says, this is that politics have bastardized, he doesn't use that word, that's my word, but politics has bastardized the mechanics of our system. And it's done so in such a way that it could, in fact, overturn our system. Now, Madison doesn't go anywhere with that, but Alexander Hamilton is also so horrified by this, he actually goes so far as to write a new amendment to the Constitution to make sure that you cannot have this winner-take-all system. But if you have won election based on a winner-take-all system, you're not going to change that system. So what happens after the election of 1800 when Madison is elected, when Jefferson is elected in the election of 1800, what happens is gradually one state after another goes ahead and it adopts the winner-take-all system of the Electoral College. So with the acceptance of that concept, the concept that you can have electors awarded according to block rather than according to district, again, the system that so changes what the founders originally set up. What you have then is across America after 1800, this establishment of the winner-take-all electoral system. So how does this play out in terms of partisanship? What happens is when Thomas Jefferson goes into the White House, he gives this speech. And he gives a speech in which he says, it's his inaugural address. He gives his inaugural address and he says, we all got pretty hot under the collar under that last election. And in fact, the election of 1800 was divisive enough that people crossed the street so they didn't have to talk to each other. Lifetime friendships were broken up. The opponents of Jefferson actually had speeches and advertisements where they said that Jefferson was going to cancel God. There was going to be no more God. And he says, we all got pretty hot under the collar under that last election, but now that I am back in power, we don't have to have parties any longer. You can all unite behind me. Because now that we've gotten rid of those bad guys who are trying to destroy America, you can all now unite behind me. And of course, that doesn't happen. What we get on the heels of the election of 1800 is two really important concepts. First of all, we get the concept that you can, in fact, have a peaceful transition of power. It's a big deal that Jefferson is elected fairly, and although don't start me on how the strings he pulls in New Jersey, or maybe you want to start me during the questions. We get the idea that it is possible for a party to change, for the government to change parties peacefully. That people are not literally going to kill each other over an election. That's a precedent. That's a norm that was established in 1800, and nobody knew that that was going to be the norm in 1800. But it's established with Jefferson when, in fact, he takes power peacefully. And this is one of my favorite quotations from Hamilton, who loathes Jefferson at this point. And of this election, he says, "I admit that his politics are tinctured with fanaticism, that he is too much in earnest with his democracy, that he has been a mischievous enemy to the principal measures of our past administration, that he is crafty and persevering in his objects, that he is not scrupulous about the means of success, nor very mindful of truth, and that he is a contemptible hypocrite. But," Hamilton says, "he's so eager to promote his own interests that he won't do anything too terribly bad." And that idea is established in 1800, that it is okay to have a peaceful transition of power, and therefore that political parties are legitimate. But it also gives us the importance of recognizing that political parties have, in fact, changed the meaning of that original Constitution, which was written in such a way that partisanship was not supposed to be part of it. And it's done so in ways that matter dramatically to us today. It matters to us, first of all, with this change in the Electoral College, which matters a lot. And I often hear, well, the Electoral College, we should go back to the way it used to be, and we should keep it the way it is because this is the way the Electoral College has always been. No, it's not. There was a change in the Electoral College in the very early years that changed what the founders wanted, and it's a change that dramatically impacts our understanding of democracy today, when in fact, in two very recent elections, we have had presidents elected who did not enjoy the support of the majority by quite a significant amount. That matters for the purity of our democracy. That matters because you need to have people who believe in the system and who believe that the system represents them. Going back to that original idea that you have to believe that your party can in fact be in charge if it wins. You have to believe that your party is going to be considered a legitimate governance, party of governance, which it isn't if you can't elect your people simply because there has been a change in the mechanics of democracy. It also matters in this moment because, as I say, there was an understanding in the way our Constitution was written that the Senate and the Congress would be a check on the president. And in our Constitution, of course, the only means that we have of checking a president who may or may not be performing the duties of office in a way that seems to advance the nation's interest is the mechanism of impeachment. That mechanism was designed by the founders because they did not believe in the idea of partisanship. They did not expect there to be a situation when a group of people would protect a president based solely on the fact that that president is a member of their party. And so we have had in American history the breakdown of the only real check we have on the president, which is Congress. And if Congress decides not to check the president, not to stand in the way of a president who may or may not have the interests of the government, the country at heart, we have a real problem. We can have a runaway president, which the founders never could have foreseen because they believed that senators, especially who are the ones who sit in judgment on a case of impeachment, would be so jealous of their own power that they would never bow down to the power of a president who seemed to be out of control. And so we have these two ways in which partisanship has attacked the very foundation of our government, of our constitutional government, and who threaten the way our mechanics work. So the point I was trying to make in the course of all this material that you probably haven't thought about since you were like in 8th grade, maybe high school, maybe even college, is that our political system depends on parties. And there's all sorts of other really interesting permutations of this, like how we get the rise of nominating conventions and how we get the rise of the mechanics of parties and why that's important and all that. But what's really important as a takeaway, I think, is that we have this what the founders called this machine that would go of itself, this constitution. But what they didn't realize was that that constitution would not go of itself without having the gasoline, if you will, of political parties to make it work, to have people who joined the president and the Congress, who made politics move forward both by advocating policies and by complaining about those policies, and that we desperately need those two political parties, but that we do have to understand today that the political system cannot work if we are trying to put together both that original machine and the rise of partisanship without recognizing that the rise of partisanship did change the way that machine worked. And I want to leave you with a quotation from John Adams, who moved into the White House on November 1st, 1800. Jefferson was the first president to move into the White House immediately after his inauguration, but Adams moved into it during his presidency. And when the night he moved into it, he wrote a letter to his wife, Abigail Adams, in which he said, I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and that all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. And with that, I would like to say, perhaps looking forward to the election that's happening 3 weeks from today, amen. And now I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
So Heather, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. My name's Barbara Burt. I am the campaign chair of the Lincoln County Democrats. And I want to apologize for the technical difficulties we had. We've never had such a big crowd on Zoom before. And in fact, Heather, I wanted to remind you about 2 years ago when you came and spoke at our campaign headquarters. During that election, I think we had maybe 60 people who came. So things have really changed. Zoom is part of it, but Heather's reach is obviously much greater than it was even then. And then it was quite big. I have a few questions here that people had sent to me ahead of time. And one I want to start off with, because I think it really follows from the ending that you just left us with, Heather. This is from Richard Barker, who's on Westport Island, Maine. He says, I fear the results if Trump wins the election because we will soon be an autocratic society. Thus, it is imperative that Democrats win this election. If the Democrats win, keep the House majority, win the Senate majority, and win the presidency, the Republican Party will surely be weakened. I am concerned that a single Democratic Party running the House, Senate, and White House could be biased inappropriately in representation going further. So my question is, after so much turmoil, should the Democrats win the House, Senate, and presidency, is it feasible for the Democratic Party to show compassion to facilitate a continuance of at least a two-party system?
That's a wonderful question, and thank you for that. And what I would say to that is that there's no reason you would know, all the work I've done on the history of the Republican Party. But the current day Republican Party, certainly in the incarnation in which it currently exists, it's not healthy. And it's not healthy, I would argue, from a conservative viewpoint. It's not healthy because it is an ideological party. That is, Republicanism in its original incarnation and in its healthy incarnations is one that embraces the idea of society as a web, if you will. If you guarantee people equality before the law and equality of access to resources, not to outcome, but access to resources, what the original Republicans argued was that would put, it would enable people to work hard and to rise, to make money and to rise, and in turn to go ahead and to support more people in the economy. One of my students once called this a Ponzi scheme, which I think is completely unfair, or a pyramid scheme. But the idea that what you do is you can have an economy and therefore a society that is constantly growing and increasing. That's very different than what the Democrats have traditionally held. But the problem with the current day Republican Party, and it's a problem that really came to the party with Nixon and then with Goldwater, then with Nixon and Reagan, and especially with Newt Gingrich. The problem is they got taken over by a group of ideologues, and they are people who do not believe in compromise, and they do not believe in anything but a very strict adherence to the idea that the government has no role other than to promote religion and to promote what they call free enterprise. So they don't believe in any kind of regulation of business, they don't believe in a basic social safety net, and they don't believe in promoting infrastructure. And all of those things are things that most Americans now agree to. They argue a lot about what that looks like. You know, what should be regulated, or what kind of social safety net there should be, or really do we need broadband in wherever. But they do agree that those are basic principles on which the government should function. The current day Republican incarnation, party incarnation, does not believe in that. They believe in a very ideological basis that says the government has no role to play in those things. Now the problem with that is you can't work with that. And one of the things that the thinkers in the Republican Party nowadays, if you are yourself a former Republican, talk about, or a Republican even talk about, is purging the party of those ideologues and then returning the party to health. Because what we've got right now is a Republican Party that is not healthy. And that's why I talk about a healthy party. It is not healthy because it does not need to reach out to a broader base. What it's doing is it's doubling down on ideologues, and it's doing so by leveraging really hateful elements of society, and by purging voters, by contracting democracy, and by manipulating the system, by cheating, frankly. And the problem with that, aside from any morals anyone might have, the problem with that is it's not healthy for democracy. It's also not healthy for the Republican Party, because it's rather, as I say, like a soccer game. You know, if one side starts to play the refs and then starts to win solely by cheating, they get fat and lazy. And the other side first gets strong, and it gets to be better and better players, but pretty soon they're not going to play any longer because the system doesn't work, or the game doesn't work any longer. And the fat and lazy players no longer can play the game, they can only work the system. And pretty soon you've lost the entire game. So if you have a party that doesn't have to compete, that can trust gerrymandering, can trust the courts to step in on their behalf all the time, can trust the fact they can simply make sure no opponents can vote, they cease to be able to advance both a legislative agenda, but also democracy. So what I would say to a concern about a fully democratic government right now is I think we need to go ahead and get rid of the Republicans who are running the Senate. Not all of them, obviously. You need them in there as an opposition voice. But they can't continue to run things because they are absolutely making it impossible for any kind of legislation to happen. It's no accident that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is not permitting any legislation to go forward. He simply stops it all dead. That is not democracy when you have an ideologue saying, I don't care if 98% of Americans want something, it's not going past me. He represents Kentucky. Great state, but he should not be in charge of our entire democracy. So I would say your concerns are well-founded in 8 years, in 12 years, not now, because right now the Republicans have a real job on hand, and that is to rebuild that party in such a way that it's attracting younger people, it's attracting moderates, it's attracting people of color. It is once again representing the extraordinarily important ideology of the Republican Party, incarnated as it was by Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower and all the Republicans we honor, and to get rid of the ideologues who have hijacked that party and taken it down an ideological dead end. Long answer to that question, but it's a great question and one that fascinates me since I study the Republican Party primarily.
So do you think that the ideologues will form a different party? I mean, do you see a split happening?
So there's a great question there. And you've caught me after a day of teaching, so I'm really kind of not giving you the simple answers here. There's also a generational split going on here. So there's a lot of older Republicans who hold their heads and say, what happened to my party? I want my party back. But there's a lot of younger people who identify with the Trump party who are not people that you want to be in league with. And what I expect to happen personally is that those people the Richard Spencers, the alt-right, the Proud Boys, the neo-Nazis, they're going to break off and become an alt-right, violent neo-Nazi party. And they're going to go back underground eventually, where they've always been there. People forget that. Those people have always existed. And when that happens, there are young, smart, I hate to call them conservatives right now because that word has been hijacked by this alt-right group, but they're young, smart, vibrant people who can create a new kind of party. And you see the Lincoln Project nodding to that. They're older. The Lincoln Project is older, but there are young writers who are writing now for not only for the Bulwark, but for the Dispatch. I don't know if you know the brand new, maybe it's almost a year old, or about that, newspaper, conservative newspaper. They're young, smart people there, and they have good ideas. Right now, they don't have anywhere to take them. So what they're doing is they're taking them into newsletters, they're taking them into alternative publications. They will create a new party, because if this old Republican Party crashes and burns, as it looks like it might well do, the ground is fertile for that new party, the young party, to rise. And I say that not least because I tell all of my students who are interested in going into politics that they should, if they are not otherwise firmly inclined, rebuild the Republican Party, because that's the place where if they go in now, they're the ones who are going to be running for senator and president in 20 years. And I'd love to see my students there.
So one of the people wrote a question earlier. This is from Tom Field, who's in South Bristol, Maine. Do you think that the United States is potentially heading into a period of organized and intentional political violence on par with what happened in Kansas in the 1950s with opposing civilian groups? So do you think it's going to get to that point, or?
No, I really don't. And here's why. A number of reasons. First of all, because before the Civil War, our political lines were regional, and they're not. We talk about they're not now. We talk about the red states and the blue states. We don't have red states and blue states. We have a lot of purple states. And Stacey Abrams puts it very well. The red states should really be called voter suppression states. Yeah. And that I think is a really big distinction. But I also want to point out a couple of things. First of all, that when we talk about the violence, first of all, there is violence in America. There's a lot of violence in America, and a lot of it we don't even pay attention to. One of the things that I always try and hit on whenever I can is that, I haven't seen the statistics for the last year, but it is my understanding that that is over 50% of our mass shootings are domestic violence. FBI recognized mass shootings because that's 4 people dead. And that's usually a domestic partner, a spouse, and children. And then the person turns the gun usually on himself. There's that kind of violence that we don't even look at. And there's also a lot of political violence out there that really is not making the papers. So one of the things that we look at when we look at the 1800s, the 1880s, is we look at all the violent strikes and we go, oh my God, there's all these violent strikes, which there are. When people look back at this moment in 100 years, they're going to go, oh my God, there's all this violent political stuff. And we are just so immersed in it, we don't recognize it as being as abnormal as it is. But when I say that, it's also worth pointing out that, I just have to say this, there's a fly around me, which is just killing me here. When you hear people talking about Civil War, you have to remember that is a talking point that is really being pushed by Russian disinformation. They want us to be talking about Civil War. They want us to be saying that. And that's something that has also been hit again and again and again by the alt-right. Are there militias and are there lone wolves who are out there who are determined to kill people? Yes, there are. Do they make up the majority of Americans? Absolutely not. And one of the things that it's going to be interesting to see is what happens after this plot that was uncovered for the attack on Gretchen Whitmer, and now it turns out they were actually looking at Governor Northam as well. When people are saying that this is a great idea to go commit violence, it might look all fine and dandy when you're hiding in your basement and you're talking big. When you're looking at life in a federal prison, it might not look the same. And I'm wondering if that's going to defang some of that. But I also think it's interesting to see, as an observer, what the Biden administration, the Biden campaign has done. They simply refuse to entertain that, because they say if we talk about it and if we say it's an option, we normalize it. We say, oh yes, it could be okay for this to happen. And for him simply to say, no, Trump is going to accept the outcome of the election, as I am, because anything else is unacceptable, I think is probably not a bad way to look at it, because I do think it's scare tactics. I do think there are a lot of what my partner calls keyboard warriors, who talk a really big game, but they're really not going to show up to commit violence en masse. Will there be individual shootings? Well, yeah, but there are in America as it is now. The targets are going to change, and it's going to be a really ugly period, I think, from November through January, regardless of who is elected. There's going to be a really ugly period. Is it going to devolve into a large-scale American violence? I'm not going to normalize that by saying yes. I'm going to say no.
Great, I like that answer. Here's a comment and question from Harry Nelson from North Yarmouth, Maine. And it sort of goes back to the difference between Washington and Hamilton and Jefferson, the long running tension between those two perspectives. He says, with the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, we are hearing how justices and would-be justices view their approach to jurisprudence as originalists and textualists. As the world has changed significantly since the US Constitution was written over 230 years ago, do you think the framers would have wanted legal decisions regarding the Constitution to take into account how society has, or should I say, will change over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, I don't think there's any doubt among historians that the framers believed that the Constitution should change. And you see this really dramatically. And my friend Joanne Freeman is a scholar of this period. She says, even at the time they said they didn't understand what the Constitution was about. They all interpreted it differently. And they said, that's the point. You guys are going to have to figure this out as it goes forward. I am extraordinarily suspicious of people who talk about originalism and textualism. And here's why. There's a couple of reasons for this. But first of all, because that strict adherence to the Constitution and to the limitation of the Constitution is always an attempt to limit what others can do. So for example, Jefferson talks a lot about strict construction of the Constitution until he wants to buy Louisiana. And when it comes time in 1803 to take on Louisiana, he looks at the fact that there's nothing in the Constitution about buying land. And he actually goes so far as to write an amendment to the Constitution to say he can do that. And his advisors say, no. Ask forgiveness, not permission, because you're never going to get this through Congress and through ratification before the deal's off the table. So go ahead and do it. And then later on, we'll see how people like it. And he's like, oh, but I'm a strict constructionist. Oh, never mind. No, I'm really not. When people start to stand on strict construction, the place you really see it is in the 1850s. And the reason that they're doing it in the 1850s is that they are the elite slaveholders, not the regular ordinary men who might enslave one or two other people and work alongside them, but the people who own vast gangs of enslaved human beings and who use them to accumulate a great deal of capital. These elite planters are going to be own more capital than 1%. They're going to be the top 1% of people in the South, which makes them, the wealthiest people by far in America. But they're a very small number of people, and they take a look at the drive after the 1830s and the 1840s, especially in the 1840s, for improvements in society, a road across the Appalachians, the dredging of rivers and harbors, things that are going to enable ordinary white men, is what they're thinking about, to rise. And they look at that and they say, there's no way we're going to let the federal government do this, because what that's going to mean is they're going to, it's only going to be a question of time till they start to mess around with human enslavement. And because that's going to cost our tax dollars. And very famously in 1858, James Henry Hammond, who's a very wealthy senator from South Carolina, and a loathsome man who not only raped his enslaved people, men and women both, but he, I should say girls and boys both, but he also raped all 4 of his nieces, who were the daughters of Wade Hampton. And we know about this because the man kept a freaking diary about it in which he discussed it. And then at the end of the day, couldn't figure out why it hurt his political career, because he said he should get credit for being as restrained as he was around those lovely creatures. Anyway, I'm not a fan of James Henry Hammond. But anyway, he gives a speech in 1858 on the floor of the Senate in which he says, it doesn't matter if 99% of Americans want us to do something. The Constitution says all that the government can do is to have an army on the frontier and to protect our property, to protect our enslaved property. And he said, this is the way it's supposed to be, because what the founders didn't want is they didn't want a democracy. They thought democracy was a terrible idea, because what they really wanted people to do was simply to elect one set of leaders or another set of leaders. And those sets of leaders can't do anything that's not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. So you guys are just all out of luck. And you people in the North are stupid, because what you're doing is you're permitting your lower classes, what James Henry Hammond calls the mudsills, to vote. And what was going to happen if you let the poor people vote, the hard workers, the people that the Southerners enslaved, if you let them vote, they were going to ask for some of the capital that they were producing. And it would only be a question of time until wealth stopped moving up. And if wealth moved up, it enabled this very small group of people to move society forward. They were the ones with the education, and they were the ones with the money, and they were the ones who had the good seeds and who knew how to create an economy. If you took that away and actually gave that money back to the people who had earned it, the people at the bottom, that whole system of moving the money up so rich people could move society forward would collapse. And this would be a redistribution of wealth that would destroy American society. So he says this in 1858, and Abraham Lincoln retorts, absolutely not. In 1859, he gives a very famous speech in which he says, and I paraphrase, screw you. The government moves forward when in fact it puts its energy behind people at the bottom, when it gives people at the bottom access to resources by dredging the harbors and building the roads and going ahead and providing protection, equal protection before the laws. And that's how society moves forward, because those people at the bottom are the ones who are going to innovate, and they're going to change, and they're going to go ahead and create new things that are going to move society in such a way that we all do better. And when Abraham Lincoln says this, of course, he's advocating a government that does, in fact, respond to the will of the people. So where do we get the rise, again, of this idea of textualism and originalism? We get it really dramatically after World War II. After you get the rise of Eisenhower's actually Supreme Court, he puts Earl Warren, the former governor of California, at the head of the Supreme Court. And Warren uses the government in that period, uses the courts in that period to expand the idea of equal rights before the law. And he does it most dramatically in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education, which outlaws segregation in the public schools. And from that, we get both the Warren Court and the Burger Court after it, both Republican courts, by the way, not Democratic courts, that expand rights, including the right to reproductive choice, Roe versus Wade in 1973, which is a Republican decision. It is written by a Republican in a Republican court. And with that, you get the rise of people who begin to complain about the expansion of rights, not so much because they complain about the expansion of rights, although certainly Southern Democrats don't like the expansion of rights, but because that court also decides that the legislation to regulate business is legal. They don't like the regulation of business, and they don't like the taxes that are going to be used to promote infrastructure. And so we get the rise of this idea really being articulated with the Powell Memo in 1971, a lawyer for the, he's a lawyer for the tobacco industry, but he writes it for this memo for the Chamber of Commerce, in which he says, we have got to use the courts to push back against these activists who are using the laws to expand civil rights and to expand regulation that has done things like given Ralph Nader a voice in protecting consumers of cars. That's ridiculous. We don't want consumer protection. That's just a misuse of the laws. So Powell writes this memo in 1971, and of course the next year Richard Nixon puts Powell on the court. And Powell begins the push toward this idea that the Constitution cannot be used in any way to expand regulation, to expand civil rights, to expand infrastructure, and that we must have this really tightly read version of what the Constitution meant. And by 1982, we've got the rise, the deliberate rise, it's only 10 years after Powell goes on the court, of a group of legal scholars coming out of Harvard, Yale, and the University of Chicago to put together the Federalist Society, which is based in the idea that the government can do nothing but protect property, as I said, these ideologues now in the Congress, protect property and protect religion. And now, as I think you know, I think it's 5 and soon to be perhaps 6 of our 9 justices are members of the Federalist Society. And they're going to legislate from the perspective that the government has no role to play in the regulation of business, in the protection of a basic social safety net, or in infrastructure. And when I say that, you know, people seem to think that that things like Social Security and the Affordable Care Act and Medicare and clean water and clean air, all those things are things that we're accustomed to and we're always going to have them. Those are things that were put in place by a court that expanded the law. Originalists will say to you that you can't change the meaning of the original Constitution except by constitutional amendment. And so all of those things cannot be done, even if Congress wants them, even if the state legislatures do them. That's how they can get around the I think, to my mind, logical problem of saying the only way you can change the government is by having people vote for new people to write new laws. They say, they strike down those laws saying, doesn't matter what you guys want. The same way James Henry Hammond said it, doesn't matter what you guys want. If you really want to do this, you got to change the Constitution. Well, imagine trying to change the Constitution for everything we want to have done. That's something that I think simply the founders would have shrugged their shoulders and said, there's absolutely no way. And you can see this in part by the fact that from the original days of the founders themselves disagreed about things, and they in turn, on 2 occasions, actually impeached people who had signed the Declaration of Independence and who had been part of the writing of the Constitution. So a long-winded way to say this, I think, is the idea of textualism serves what is, they talk about it being tradition. What they're doing is they're very much serving a modern day political imperative that they're masquerading as a historical moment.
So that brings up the question of the whole discussion you hear now of packing the court, adding more justices. Can you talk a little bit about what that would mean in a historical sense?
Sure. The Constitution sets up 3 branches of government. The 3rd article is the judiciary. They didn't really give a lot of thought to what the judiciary was all about. So we don't get a number of justices established until the Judiciary Act of 1789, very important act for a lot of reasons. But it doesn't set the number of Supreme Court justices, so they expand and contract over time. The last time they were expanded was in 1869 under Grant. So we have this tradition of having 9 justices, but of course on different occasions, FDR tried to increase the number of them. People tend to forget that the Republicans talked about decreasing the number of them in 2016 when they thought Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. So when people talk about packing the court, that's a reference to actually adding people to the court. It's a red herring. I mean, it's whatever, you know, it's like, that's a Republican talking point. What is really, there's 2 things that to my mind are more important. First of all, that there has been, on the part of the Republican Party, a concerted effort since the Reagan administration to fill the court with members of the Federalist Society who are original textualists. And that is really clear. You can see it in Reagan's Attorney General, Edwin Meese, actually said, we are going to put the Reagan Revolution, that is the attempt to turn the clocks back to before the New Deal, we're going to make sure that that exists in the courts so that even if the American people turn against it, we will protect it in the courts. And of course, as you probably saw today, Sheldon Whitehouse on the floor of Congress pointed out that the Supreme Court decides in favor of business 80% of the time right now, which is really quite astonishing. We had the same thing happen in the 1890s. We had a court that did the exact same thing. So what is really worth looking at is the makeup of that court. That's why people were upset about Robert Bork when he was nominated to the court. Not just that he was the guy who carried out the Saturday Night Massacre, but also because he wanted to throw out the entire system of the New Deal that was in place because he argued for this contextualist idea. You also have among those people a real reach for a stronger executive. They believe in something that's called the Unitary Executive, and that the executive should have more power than Congress, including for things like legislation. So it was actually Samuel Alito who came up with the idea during the Reagan administration of signing statements by which the president said what and what not he was going to do when Congress passed a law. So I think it's worth looking at the philosophies of the people who are on the existing court and whether or not that reflects the will of the American people as a whole. I don't think it does. And my concern is not really with Republicans or Democrats. My concern is with the legitimacy of democracy. If people don't believe that court represents them, they're not going to believe that our laws are legitimate. And that's a huge problem for democracy. Now, there's one other thing I want to throw out about the courts and about the Congress that I think is really important and we don't think a lot about, and we should. And that's that when the founders wrote the idea of the judiciary, in order to be a judge, you had to ride the circuit. You literally had to ride a horse from courthouse to courthouse. So there was within our system a de facto limit on who could be a judge, because you were not, love or hate the woman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not going to be riding a horse around the circuit in her last days. And so we did have de facto limits on who could hold office and who could be a judge. And we have lost those. The other thing I would say is that because of that, because of the fact people quit because they didn't want to ride the stupid circuit any longer. Because of that, the idea of Supreme Court justices being there for life has made this a much bigger position and a much more important position than it ever was before. So, for example, in 1877, it was not an uncommon thing when an associate justice of the Supreme Court gave it up to become a senator. It was just like, it wasn't a nothing job, but it wasn't also this godlike job that it has become. There was overturning in it. There were people coming and going, and there were people who had held elective office. I believe this is the first time in American history that we have had a court that did not have people on it who had held elective office. I believe that Sandra Day O'Connor was the last person on the court to hold an elective office. And in the past, there was always an attempt to make sure there were people on it who had held elective office so that they would continue to represent the people and to understand where the people were. We have gotten away from that. And that is a huge problem, one that we're going to need to solve. Whether we solve it by adding more people to the court, I'm personally not actually a fan of that. I am much more a fan of going back into some of the recent nominations and examining things like their finances and to see whether or not they were perhaps compromised when they were put on the court. And I think that would actually tell us a lot about who should currently be sitting on that court. But those are both crises in our democracy that I think in the past had answers that maybe now we need to recreate in the mechanics of our system so that it is not quite so determined by today's political partisanship.
Heather, thank you so much. I wish we could keep going for hours, but I'm sure that you're exhausted, plus you still have work to do.
I have work to do.
Jan, I'll turn it over to you.
Just as a quick close, thank you again, Heather, and thank all of you for staying with us. This is an amazing topic, and I'm sure you were reflecting back as I was to think, boy, why didn't I pay more attention? You know, in my junior high school and high school days, I would have absorbed so much more. But Heather, you're so much more interesting. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us. Special thanks again to Heather. Also, Barbara, for putting the technical pieces, and Autumn Maloney, who's not on with us, for giving us the infrastructure. set up. I just wanted to let you all know that if you do have additional interest or questions regarding the Lincoln County Democrats, please feel free to contact us via Facebook, or Barb, is there another vehicle that would be?
They can go to the website, the LincolnCountyDemocrats.com, and find all sorts of information there, including, I think we'll have a recording of this. So if you missed the beginning, I know it was really hard to get in. That will be available. I think Heather has very generously said that would be a possibility. So we'll have it somewhere in a very prominent place, and we'll also put it on our Facebook page as well, so that you can catch up on what you missed.
Great. Thank you again. Good night, everyone.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Heather.